Hello and welcome. I hope that you're all doing well. In this video, we're going to start to take a look at post requests and discuss a lot of details surrounding the idea of post requests as well as how to get them set up and working well in our application. And in order to demonstrate this, I figured that I would start to walk through an actual demo of a project where we're going to deal with students, as I talked about in the last video. So the idea is going to be that we can post student data that will be saved in our application, and then we can get the student data later from our get endpoint. So that's going to be the main idea of our application. So let's go over to the code and take a look and see what we can do. So first things first, we're actually going to need a couple of extra components in order to make this work. For one, in order to store data from a post request, we need something that can actually store the data, of course. So this is a little bit tricky because we haven't talked about databases yet. We will talk about them later on, but right now we don't really have any concept of a database, and they're rather complex to go over in such a short amount of time. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to work with a persistent storage data structure that exists in Node.js that is called node persist. What node persist is going to do is it's going to create a map that can map an ID to a value. And what we'll be able to do is we'll be able to place data into there using an ID to value mapping and then retrieve it using the ID as well. So the idea is going to be that we're going to have student IDs mapping to just student names. So when we post, we'll add that into the storage, and when we will get it from the storage. So to set that up, first we're going to have to install our node persist. So it'll be npm I node-persist. So that will install the node persist component. And in addition to this, we're also going to need one other component, which is called body parser. So we're going to say node I npm I body -parser. What the body parser does is it allows us to parse JSON data properly. So like I said before in the get video, when we deal with parameters and data objects, they are typically represented with JSON. So in order to be able to parse that properly, we need to use this body parser utility. So with that all set up, let's go ahead and set up our components. We're going to set up our storage. So we're going to say const storage equals require node-persist. And then we're going to set up our body parser by saying var body parser equals require body parser. We set up storage as a constant because we shouldn't be changing the storage in our application. Once we set up the storage, it will be set up as is, and we will use it. We won't ever really change it. Meanwhile, all the other ones are vars because they could potentially be reassigned at some point. Now with our body parser, we actually have to create a specific type of parser, which would be a JSON parser. We could do that by saying var JSON parser equals body parser.json. This object will be used in order to parse JSON in any of our scenarios that we need it for. Finally, we're going to initialize our storage by going storage.init. That will initialize our storage on our device. This storage is local, so it's just going to sit inside of this folder here, this node persist storage. So that's where that is going to be placed, and we'll be able to work with the data through there. Now from here, we can actually start to write our app.post. So to do a post, we're going to need some different methods than what we have described so far. So I'll introduce some new ideas here. So we have app.post. And the endpoint that I'm going to use is /student. And then what we're going to do is we're going to set up what's called an asynchronous request. And that looks like this. What is an asynchronous request? Well, when we add data into our storage, it may take time for it to be added in. Rather than sitting and waiting for the data to be added before we proceed, we do things asynchronously. What that means is that we run it at the same time as any other code in our application. So rather than the code having to wait for this database operation to complete, what's going to happen is it's just going to proceed on until it hits a point where we tell it to wait, and then it will stop and wait for it to complete. So that's the general idea of async. It's asynchronous execution. It's a little bit tricky to wrap your head around at first, but one thing that sort of helps is thinking about how web pages load. So when you load up a web page, the content is displayed to you, right? If we were to not do things asynchronously, what would happen is the web page would sit and it would wait and it would wait until everything is done, and then it would display everything at once. If you look at a web page, when it loads up some content and then it waits and then loads up more content, and everything sort of loads in pieces. So that's the same idea as what async is doing. What it's doing is it loads what it can, and then as things complete, it loads in those pieces without like freezing everything in place and waiting for something to complete. So that's the general idea of asynchronous. And the asynchronous things that we have is the storage in this case. So then next up, we need to actually get the data that's being sent to us. In order to do that, we have to discuss a little bit about how the data is going to be sent to us. So when we go into our postman here, we'll be able to see in the body here, we can go and click raw and then JSON. And this is how we can send data through JSON format. Now remember, JSON format uses these curly braces, and then it maps a property to a value. So like I said before, we're gonna have a student ID, and we're gonna have a student name. And this is the way that these are going to map. So you see that we have ID, and then we have name. Each of them have a value. So the ID is 1, the name is Scott. So that's the way that our data is going to be formatted. So the main things that I need to know is what are these properties going to be? Because in order to retrieve them, I need to know what they are. In this case, it's student ID and student name are my two properties. So the way that we can gather this data is like this. We say const student underscore ID, student underscore name equals rec.body. What this is going to do is it's going to go into the body of the request. It's going to find student ID and place it into the student ID variable. It's then going to find student name and place that into the student name variable. So it's just going to take each component and place them where they need to go inside of this list. That's what this syntax is doing. It's just placing values from the body into their respective parameters. And then from here, we just have to put the data into the storage. And we do that with the following. We say await storage dot set item student underscore ID student underscore name. What this is doing is await is going to wait for this particular command to finish. So this is an asynchronous command, and the await is saying wait until this particular line of code finishes before proceeding. That's something that we have to do in order to tell it, since it's asynchronous, that we want to wait for it to finish. If we didn't do that, it would just continue executing to the next line of code. We're going to wait for this to finish. Set item is going to set a new item into this map, which maps this student ID that was provided to the student name that was provided. So basically now we just have a storage item that has an ID that maps to a name, and that's been added into our storage. From here, I'm just going to go ahead and send back a response. I'm going to say res.send added student. So just get a brief overview. We provide the student ID and name through the request body. It's parsed, it's put in our storage, and then they get back a message that says added student and all is good. Now you could of course use like things like try catches to have error handling. We're just going to leave things simple for now, and we won't have to worry about that. But if you want to look into that sort of idea, that is something that you can do as well to return an error if this happens to fail. So at this point, our post is created. Let's go ahead and try it out here. So we'll say node index, and then we will come over here. You can see that I am sending a post request to the student endpoint. I have student ID as 1 and student name as Scott. Again, this is in the body raw JSON. Make sure those are set. As long as those are set, you should be good. We will send this to our database. It looks like we had some problem in the response here. It is having trouble finding the student ID. Oh, right. Okay, sorry. There's one small component that's just missing here. All we have to do is inside of this function declaration, we need to provide it with the JSON parser as well. Just that way it knows how to parse the JSON data. Sorry, and I could just delete this here. So we just have to make sure to have the JSON parser here to provide that to be able to parse the body. So that's just the other thing that we need. Let's try it now and everything should be good. I will run node index. I will come over here and I will send the data. And as you can see, now we get the successful added student. So that gets us our post request up and running. In the next video, I will show you how to do a GET request to be able to retrieve the data. So thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.